Okay. So yeah, it's my great pleasure to introduce Lisa Chernenko from the Oxford Internet Institute, who today will give a talk about dehumanization in Russian and Ukrainian Telegram and the role of in-group identity and perception. All right, great to have you here, Lisa. Take it away.
Thank you so much for introduction. So my name is Lisa. I'm DPhil candidate in social data sciences, but that's one of the two programs in Oxford Internet Institute. And I just realized that the picture on the cover of this presentation is a little bit misleading, but it originates from the overarching topic of my PhD, which is not about dehumanization, which is a specific type of hate speech, basically, but about re-humanization. How do we shift back from negative dehumanized perception of the other to acknowledging humanity in them? But yeah, let's start. First of all, just letting you know, this presentation contains dehumanizing content for demonstration purposes. So take care. Let me first start with the term, because I understand that dehumanization is the term that sometimes called, I mean, it's not widely used. Basically, it's the act of perceiving or treating people as less than human. So in most blatant or explicit forms, it is reflected in comparison of someone human to non-human, like animals, machines, non-human creatures, or inanimate substance. But it can also represent itself in other manifestations, such as de-individuation, indifference, denial of pro-social values, etc., of which I will speak later. So this is basically what we are going to speak about. And like, why this topic? It turns out that dehumanization contributes to a lot of very dangerous phenomena, such as genocide, support for war, mass violence, extreme outgroup policies, etc. And I mean, it had been studied a lot, and we know a lot about how bad it is, but we know very, very little about what to do with that, which basically explains my focus on this topic. Yeah. So, I mean, at the end of this presentation, I will connect how the research question I will talk about today connects us to rehumanization, to potential policies to introduce. So specifically, because blatant form of dehumanization are particularly dangerous, when I write DH, it means dehumanization. I'm only focusing on blatant forms of dehumanization of others defined in political and national terms. So let me start by describing the data I'm working with. So the case I'm focusing on is the case of relationships between Ukrainians and Russians following the Russian full-scale war. Sorry. Can I just ignore what's being written in the chat and you can monitor that for me?
Yeah, I will take care of it.
Yeah, perfect. So relationships between Ukrainian and Russians during full-scale invasion of Ukraine. For this paper, I'm using Telegram channels as a source of data, and it's not so widely used and popular here. So let me just comment on what is that. This is not like a group chat. This is a broadcast tool, and anyone who knows the name of the channel can join them. Conditional on the channel being open to everyone, or some of them require administrators to accept you there. But once you join, it's like following someone on Instagram. You just get messages from them, instant messages. It turns out to be very, very popular in the region. I mean, there are many channels with millions of followers, and it's a very popular tool. Specifically in Ukraine, like 84% of people have Telegram on their phones, and all of them use Telegram channels to follow news. Time frame is 2 months before the invasion and 2 months after the invasion, 2022. This is just a little illustration of data I'm working with. On the left, there is a post that dehumanizes Ukrainians, where they are compared to infection, and it says we should get rid of them. On the right, there is a case dehumanizing Russians, where a Russian soldier who invaded Ukraine is compared to an orc or a well-done steak. So this is as bad as that. This is what I call blatant dehumanization. What I do with the data. So first, I created a list of 100 most popular Telegram channels in Russia, 100 most popular in Ukraine, and collected data during the 4 months, posted during the 4 months listed here, 2 months before, 2 months after the invasion. I filtered out posts that do not mention groups of interest. I classified the post as dehumanizing, neutral, and something in between that's actually not of interest for the study. And there are two approaches, dictionary-based approach and LLMs-based approach for classification, of which I will speak later. And with LLMs, I use prompting. I developed a prompt that classifies it, and I run it so I'm playing with it, to be honest. It can be 2 or 3 times. And then I only use posts that are systematically classified as neutral or systematically classified as dehumanizing. And for analysis, I take all dehumanizing posts and bootstrap neutral ones. And this is just the overall picture of this. This is the number of posts that we have. All for both Ukraine and Russia, we have over 400,000 of posts. And you can see that it's actually less than 100 channels for Ukraine and Russia for a very simple reason. Telegram is super, super dynamic. So if you create a list of channels and a week later you start collecting data, some of them have disappeared, turned private, etc. So eventually I had less than I expected. So all Russian channels are posting in Russian, Ukrainian channels, mostly in Ukrainian, but up to like almost 40% post in Russian. And here is the, now I will tell you about my research question. So there are NLP tools for measuring dehumanization. They have been proposed already, but first, these NLP tools have not been validated against ground truth. I have some questions about theory of dehumanization they kind of assume. So when we speak of dehumanization, theory of dehumanization assumes that when someone is dehumanized, they are perceived as being less developed, being all the same, having no agency, meaning that they cannot decide for themselves, they cannot think rationally, etc. They do not care for each other, so miss some communal values. And in general, they're described as unwanted and disgusting. So more formally, this can be described as negative evaluation, de-individuation, denial of agency, denial of pro-social values, and indifference and humiliation. And basically, existing tools focus on this. So dehumanization is about who they are. It's about how we perceive who they are. But there is one more theoretical aspect in dehumanization, which is dehumanized other is perceived to be very different from us. So formally, this is can be described as psychological distancing or vertical comparison. We are good, they're bad. But this aspect assumes that dehumanization has to do with what we think of ourselves. So my question is, what is the role of in-group perception in dehumanization? When we dehumanize other, does it mean that we perceive ourselves better than when we don't dehumanize others? So my contribution in this, I was going to say paper, it turns out to be several papers. But first, I'm testing validity of existing NLP tools. I'm proposing some new NLP tools, and which is most important for me today. In this presentation, I'm testing the role of in-group perception for the phenomenon dehumanization. So the research question, the last aspect is described by the research question: is outgroup dehumanization solely rooted in outgroup perception, what we think about them, or does it encompass a comparative in-group focus dimension, us versus them, we are good, they are bad? So what I'm doing, I'm creating a contrasted data set, so it only has clearly blatant dehumanizing posts and neutral posts. I measure aspects of in-group and out-group perception, such as the individuation or agency, for these posts. And then I compare dehumanizing and neutral posts to conclude whether in-group perception plays a role in the phenomenon or not. So basically, I'm using a set of variables and test which of them best explain the difference between dehumanizing and neutral posts, and to see whether these are mostly out-group perception variables or in-group, out-group disparity variables, if that makes sense. Okay. Why this is important? So I've started saying that basically I'm working in the direction of rehumanization. This is important because if dehumanization is just about out-group perception, we should target by the audiences with some out-group narratives, something about them. If it's about ourselves as well, then there should be identity, in-group identity shift. It should happen before we will feel safe enough to rehumanize others. Okay, so here are my hypotheses. So here F is the general notation for relevant in-group and out-group perception dimensions. I'm working with the four. Individualized perception versus de-individuation, agency, prosociality, and negative perception. So let's imagine that F is agency. So we are able to measure how much agency is assigned in texts to in-group and out-group. I'm testing three groups of hypotheses for every F. The first would assume that out-group agency would be higher, out-group agency would be higher in neutral posts than in dehumanizing posts. So it's totally about out-group. The second group would assume that in-group will have higher agency in dehumanizing posts than in dehumanizing posts than out-group would have. And basically, the third group of hypothesis is about in-group, out-group difference, and it's hypothesized to be bigger in dehumanizing posts than in neutral posts. So the difference in, for example, agency between in-group and out-group will be bigger in dehumanizing posts than in neutral. And basically, the last two groups of hypotheses speak for the role of in-group in the phenomenon of dehumanization. And in addition to that, just because no one addressed that so far, I'm testing the relationship between affective polarization and dehumanization. Affective polarization as the distance between, basically exactly what I mentioned, good us, bad them, right? So distance between valence of in-group and out-group. So these are the NLP tools I'm applying to measure aspects of dimensions of dehumanization or humanized perception as the opposite side of the same construct. So it's vertical comparison, as I mentioned, versus equal treatment, de-individuation, agency, and acknowledgement of communality and pro-social values. I don't know whether I should focus too much on that. Some of these are based on word embedding, some of these are lexicon-based, some of them very, very descriptive, such as if we want to measure how de-individuated is out-group in a text or in-group in a text, we may just count the number of times that out-group label is used in plural versus singular form, how much times they use as a generalized out-group label, etc. So these are really different measures, and I'm not even listing all of them, but yeah, some of them I'm just following some methodology that has been already proposed. Some of them are proposed by myself, but maybe let's stop now just to make sure that this is more or less clear, or maybe confusing or whatever. Is this fine? Should I proceed? Okay. So what I do with the actual data, once I collected data using Telegram API, I had to filter out posts that are not discussing groups of interest. So I've created a dictionary, and it turned out that the simplest way is just to develop dictionaries. So I developed 3 dictionaries for both groups, Ukrainian and Russian. Ukrainian and Russian. First is like official terms such as Kremlin. The second group is positional terms such as enemy. So in many posts, they just say enemy did this or that, and it means that outgroup doing that. And the third group is derogatory, such as Ukronasis or orcs with respect to Russians. And it turned out that it worked well. It worked out well enough. So both precision and recall were over 95%, except for, I guess, positional group with respect to Russian, but that doesn't really affect the overall usefulness of the tool. Sorry, I just wrote this today, like 2 hours before. This doesn't look really pleasant. And I don't know whether I should focus on that at all, because this is about how I first qualitatively coded a test sample. So if qualitative analysis is not of interest, I'm probably just skipping that and will just mention that we had 2 coders, myself and my colleague. We had long discussions about what it means to what is dehumanization. We developed a code book together, and then a code book meaning just description, what we understand as de-individuation, what we understand of denial of agency. And then independently, each of us labeled some more than 200 cases. And I only used as dehumanizing in the test sample those cases which we both agreed that they are blatantly dehumanizing, and as neutral ones, only those cases where both of us agreed. And cases in between are just 0.5. We eventually will ignore them. So intercoder reliability it turned out to be also quite high. It was like 94 point something, almost 95. Yeah. So yeah.
This was to establish the ground truth.
To establish the ground truth. Yeah, if you want me to discuss that in more detail, I'm really happy, but I don't want to bother you with that because I understand that's not genuinely the focus of the lab.
So
yeah.
When you coded, so you say at the top there you had 3 categories. So is that essentially how you were coding?
Yeah.
Into at that point, just into these 3 categories? You weren't breaking it down.
It was more detailed, but eventual. So the output was 0, 1, or 0.5. So how we actually did that, we started with the components. So does this represent extreme negative evaluation? Does it represent de-individuation, denial of agency? And after that, we evaluated, okay, is dehumanizing or not? It turned, and we allowed us, when making the decision, do we perceive this as dehumanizing or not to count number of aspects. But it turned out that typically those posts that have 3 or more aspects of dehumanization are blatantly dehumanizing. There are a few, though, that have 2 and they're still blatantly dehumanizing, etc. So this was just to dive into the topic and make sure we understand what we are coding.
So you used the dimensions in order to do your evaluation, but you didn't code whether certain pieces of text had dehumanization characteristics attributed to them.
Sorry, do you mean, so we first labeled all of these dimensions, and then not independently, but as a separate evaluation, whether it's dehumanizing or not. It helped really because when you just read it and try to evaluate, you're lost. Because this is such a complex concept that I started labeling it myself and realized, oh my God, I need a second coder, and we need long discussions, which we eventually had. But and for also in the beginning, I was like, I probably need to develop a strict rule. And it seemed that 3+ dimensions means that this is blatant dehumanization. And eventually we decided that we will just use our subjective evaluation, but only after we thought a lot about every particular post. So sometimes it's two dimensions and it's still blatantly dehumanizing, and we agree on that.
Has there been other research on dehumanization in other contexts that you could leverage for your own?
Not really. I was building my methodology based on other studies of different types of hate speech.
Yeah.
But dehumanization, I never saw a study that would develop some ground truth measurements. There are qualitative studies, but that's a completely different story. Like they weren't actually labeling like we did. Yeah, I also developed a dictionary of group identifier words, some of which are dehumanizing themselves, like orc or Ukrainazis, right? So we also use that. If this word is mentioned, then at least this dimension is positive. So this is how we did that. This is just to let you know, this is what code book looked approximately. So dimensions, indicative keywords, just to give an idea, context-specific examples of these dimensions. If you want to speak, so I can go back to that if it's of interest. So what we end up with in our test sample is 225 posts. This is just a test sample to make sure that we can develop a prompt that would work well. This is the number of dehumanizing, neutral, and this borderline cases. And you can also see the number of posts about Russians. And this also split into posts in Ukrainian language and in Russian language. And the number of posts about Ukrainians. This is not too much, but kind of allows to evaluate performance. So then I did a lot of experimenting with prompt, and at the moment, the best prompt contains the following. This is for GPT 3.5 Turbo. GPT-4 is just too expensive for me. I'm a poor PhD student. So specifying the role of the system, I will decode that later. Specifying the role, specifying the context, like Russian war in Ukraine, categories to return, definition of dehumanization, code book, and then I asked the model to explain the choice. I'm not using the explanation at all, but when it explains, it performs better. And the temperature that turned out to be more performing good was 0.5. I also tried providing it with examples and explanations for examples, like this is dehumanizing because it wasn't helpful eventually. Or at least based on the metrics I was targeting, because I was not targeting accuracy, for example. So, for example, this is what is the role, right? This is the task. Annotate a given post by Russian Telegram channel in Russian language, and sometimes it's Ukrainian language, etc. Then I return the categories, command that use the definition, etc. Here is the post. And I start with output so that, because it also improves the performance. This is the role of the system. UI trained coder, fluent in Russian, Ukrainian languages with advanced degree in psychology, etc. Then I provide the definition, the very, very long code book, and then explain the rule. So if a post contains major manifestation, which is comparison to non-human, it is annotated as one. When a post has several, etc. So basically, I described how we made the decision. So this is not yet done. I will also try other models. I will also try translating, because so far it was prompt in English, examples, keywords in native language, in the original language, I mean. I will also experimenting. Maybe it makes sense to translate everything to English or translate everything to the language, or Russian or Ukrainian. But even at the moment, it works okay to work with, to get a big enough sample. I expect that the final sample, after I run this prompt for the whole data set, even 2 times would be enough. I have more than 1,000 dehumanizing cases in the final data set, which is enough to make some conclusions. So while the rest of the analysis is to be done yet, so I cannot tell you about, this is how agents work there. I still have some other interesting evidence to share. So I will start with the descriptive results, which are interesting in general in the context of Russian war in Ukraine. And the second one will be about the role of in-group perception, which we can judge about already. So first, who are those who are dehumanizing others on Telegram? So I analyzed those Telegram channels which are most prone to dehumanization, and it turned out that in Russian sector of Telegram, these were mostly pro-government or at least state-affiliated media. I cannot prove that because, I mean, we never know who is posting with this specific name of Telegram channel, but this is my qualitative evaluation. And in Ukraine, these were mostly, bloggers, some local leaders, etc., which I would generalize as general public, so representative of general public. So therefore, I would say that dehumanization in Russian Telegram was coming top down, while Ukrainian was bottom up. Russian dehumanizing language uses limited amount of cliches and narratives. It also heavily relies on disinformation. So as a follow-up, I would probably love to use some hopeful automatic tool that would suggest, oh, this is probably this, which would evaluate probability of disinformation in specific posts to show that. But qualitatively, I really see they rely on disinformation, which is not the case with Ukrainian posts. And the way Russian posts dehumanize is like exploiting and amplifying historical grievances. It's like, there are no actual reasons for that, but let's remember what happened 80 years ago, etc. While in Ukraine, it's very, very reactive. And it probably serves protective, defensive purposes, but that is what I was able to observe. Speaking of temporal dynamics, unfortunately, my very small time window wouldn't allow me to show that well, but here I'm showing a visualization, a graph from a work of my colleague who was using similar tools to measure dehumanization, and they showed that actually the peak of dehumanizing language in Russian Telegram happened well before the invasion, 7 months before the invasion. So the blue line here is summer 2021, and the red line is the time of invasion. So we see local peak, but it's actually local. Which kind of speaks for the argument that probably they were preparing, probably the state was trying to enforce, to persuade their citizens that it's a good idea to fight against Ukraine. If I do that with my data, I will just see this. It's just not enough, not big enough window for that. So yeah, and speaking of dynamics in terms of which language was used, is that's what I see. In Russian Telegram, it was intensified use of the same jargons, of the same narratives, the same grievances that have been observed there a year ago, and basically starting from 2014, they were already popular. There are some nuances though, but in Ukraine, we could see how these new terms, new metaphors, new narratives developed following the invasion. I read a lot of this hate speech posts, and I can say that it took from several hours to basically 1 day for them to really starting using very, very strong language. Yeah, so the argument is probably dehumanization from Russian side was proactive and top-down. From Ukrainian side, it probably was reactive. And also, I'm really interested in what you think about that. It turned out the classification works much better for Russian posts about Ukrainians. It works worse for Ukrainian posts in Russian, and the worst classification performance is for Ukrainian posts about Russians in Ukrainian. Okay, Ukrainian is relatively low resource language, maybe that's the reason, but I also would interpret that is when you use limited number of cliches, it's easier to classify than when it's people speak of the same thing in different ways, which may confuse the model. We also observed rise in outgroup discussions in general. We also observed rise in derogatory posts in general, but in Russian case, it tripled following the invasion. In Ukrainian Telegram, it doubled after the invasion. So these percentages are not based on final data and final classification. These are based on dictionary-based classification of dehumanizing versus neutral. And also the use of we became more prevalent. It has increased in Russian. So yeah, we as a general in-group identifier, we are speaking of us as a united group, etc. It generally is more prevalent in Ukrainian Telegram. But following the invasion, it has increased in Russia. So they have started speaking of us, Russians, etc. after the invasion, but it has fallen in Ukraine, which is also interesting. I can interpret that if this is of interest. But I've started with the general research question. What is the role of in-group perception in the phenomenon of dehumanization? I don't yet have final data to answer that question. But if I just analyze posts that are dehumanizing versus neutral based on dictionaries, and use the very simple simple tool to measure in-group, whether in-group perception, frequency of use we. So it turned out that in general, dehumanizing language is definitely the way to speak about us. So if we, sorry for this very simple tables, they contain percentages of posts. And so we see that dehumanizing posts more frequently discuss us, discuss in-group. And this happens both in Russian and Ukrainian Telegram. This difference is up to twice bigger, right? So, I mean, it's almost doubled. For the frequency of discussing us is almost twice as big in dehumanizing posts than in neutral. But this wasn't the case in Ukraine before the invasion. So if we look at Ukrainian posts and look at the before the invasion statistics, approximately 20% of posts were discussing in-group, whether these posts were dehumanizing Russians or not. But in Russia, this difference was observed even before the invasion. So this kind of suggests that the using negative perception, negative view of others probably was exploited to speak about who we are. This is at least my interpretation. So preliminary conclusions are that image of the other can reinforce the sense of in-group unity. And this is particularly true when the other is dehumanized. And this is particularly true for the aggressor and before the act of aggression. So as a takeaway from here, I would say from these preliminary conclusions is that we should probably target in-group identity when we want to rehumanize others. So if something is wrong in how we perceive ourselves, just targeting narratives, using narratives about, oh, they are not that bad, might not work out. This simply might not be enough. So we should reinvent perception of in-group in order for rehumanization to happen. And also these policies, potential interventions should be different for aggressor and defender. Yeah, a more technical description of the same thing is in this paper that was published for the ACM Web conference this year. So you can check it out if this is of interest. And I would wrap up by explaining basically my motivation for that. So this is a very simple screenshot or picture from a recent study. It's also done following the Russian invasion of Ukraine and in the same context. And basically they were just using, this was an experiment using interventions trying to reduce support for attributive violence against Russians. So, okay, yes, Russians do war crimes. Do you think that conducting war crimes against them is acceptable? So they were targeting this kind of views. And
Sorry, everyone, we had some internet connectivity issues in the room here.
Apologies, everyone. Some internet disruption. Yay. So what presenters view? Let's show. Yeah, I'm back. So let me just double check. Yeah, that I should be heard. So the next paper that I'm starting working on is actually about rehumanizing language. And this is just a screenshot of one of the news articles that describes Ukrainians for Russian audience in a way that rehumanizes them. So I will collect a data set of such articles. The first thing that I will do is just to test, whether rehumanizing post address in group perception as well. So this would be meaningful. And second, I would also analyze which rehumanizing attempts, which rehumanizing articles were more successful, more persuasive, judging on the number of shares, number of likes, comments, etc., on social media, specifically Facebook and VK. Yeah, and I just want to let everyone know that I also part of the Ukraine case studies, a group of research. So there is a group of researchers who focuses on consequences of Russian war in Ukraine for information communication and cybersecurity. We've conducted 3 roundtables, so we are really focused on the topic. And please tell others who is interested in this similar topic. And it was really recently that the first results from our survey we conducted in August in Ukraine about media use and trust in media in Ukraine was published. And it is from there that I know that 84% of Ukrainians have Telegram on their phones. Yeah, and this study is supported by UNESCO and people of Japan, thanks to them. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, do we have any questions? And like also to the audience online, feel free to either unmute yourself or post questions in the chat, and I'll read them out loud.
Can I start? Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. So yeah, super interesting. Really, yeah, really interested to see how the work develops. So I had a question about the dimensions that you're using. So you analyze a lot of a smaller sort of test set of data qualitatively. So I was interested in whether any of that analysis have identified aspects of dehumanization that perhaps didn't fit within some of those pre-existing dimensions, or whether you found that most of what you found sort of did fit within those dimensions that we identified in prior.
So you mean that we labeled post with respect to de-individuation, denial of agency, etc., whether it coincided with our judgments about, whether this feels dehumanizing.
Or whether you've identified any other forms of dehumanization when you were out constantly analyzing your data.
Any other forms? Yeah. Qualitative findings. Dehumanization is also this or that. Actually not. I should say that theory of dehumanization is quite well developed. I was just using dimensions which were explored and proposed by other researchers. There is kind of concept. There's a lot on dehumanization. So I just I did a big lit review, and then I just summarized everything I was able to find. It seems quite consistent with what we see in the data, what we feel is dehumanizing.
It was more of a top-down analysis, more of a deductive analysis that you applied.
Yeah, we started from theory. It cannot be. So the next part of my DPhil PhD study would be absolutely different, because rehumanization is not even a term yet. It has been used occasionally, but yeah. And also, I think maybe the reason why I didn't find anything else is that, well, I'm analyzing quite simple and short texts. Maybe if I would, analyze long essays or some news articles, etc., I might have observed something else, but it's sometimes just 3 words. Sometimes it's a paragraph, but no more than that. It's like Twitter or something in terms of not really Twitter. You can post long texts, but it's relatively uncommon.
Yeah, and you talked about these sort of slightly different. So you talked about this more sort of top-down approach within the sort of Russian data sets, and then a more bottom-up approach in the Ukrainian data sets or the Ukrainian messages. Were you looking at? Did you look at things like bots or some things that may be inherently more consistent with that sort of governmental sort of forms of communication?
I did not do it yet. So I just want to first finish this. Oh my God, I have regret that I didn't just fine tune the model, because to be honest, developing a prompt was. So yeah, it takes time. The next step would be to try to filter out, not to filter out, but identify which of the posts are likely automatically produced, but I didn't do it yet. I have expectations about that, to be honest, particularly about Russian Telegram. And also it was before large-scale use of LLMs, before ChatGPT, right? Which would simplify my task, basically.
Yeah.
Okay, there are some questions from the online audience. So Sarah asks, maybe you did mention this at the start of your talk, but who are the main audience of the Telegram posts you examine?
Yeah, I probably just stop sharing now. Oh, out. Sorry, stop sharing here. Sorry. So Telegram is a very, very popular means of information exchange in Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, in the region in general. Like I mentioned in the beginning that 84% of Ukrainians have Telegram installed on their phones. And I cannot imagine that they have it installed and then didn't join any channel. So it's basically all people. It's so speaking of age, for example, yeah, there is a tendency that those who use Telegram are on average a little bit younger. But first, it's a little bit, and second, it's just on average. Otherwise, we would find people from 18 years old to 82 years old. On average, people using Telegram are a little bit more educated. But again, you have all of them. It's the same in Russia. It's the same in Belarus. I'm myself Belarusian, so I used to live in Russia for some time. So informally, people, I use it for all kinds of, otherwise people would use YouTube probably. So it's for education purposes. It's to follow political news. It's etc. 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 So I don't know whether it answers your question.
So yeah, and then in the meantime, it does. Thanks. Okay. So then there's a follow-up question. Did you use your qualitative findings to train a custom detection model for dehumanizing language? Can you comment on whether these dehumanizing linguistics generalize to different contexts? For example, in US politics, I can imagine this could equally apply if your linguistic features turn out to be fundamentally robust enough.
Yeah. So there are 2 answers to that. But there are 2 questions, but the second question has 2 answers to it. So I did not try to fine-tune the model, if that's what you mean, because for fine-tune, it's a complex concept. And for even attempting fine-tuning a model, I would need like at least 500 cases, ideally 1,000. I have 2 languages, and like Russian posts, Ukrainian posts about Russians and Russian, Ukrainian posts about Russian and Ukrainian. I need a lot of data, and labeling them manually is a lot of time. So my initial idea would be just, if prompting works, I would just go for it. Eventually, it was much longer than I expected, but but that's what I did. We definitely can fine-tune the model. We just once I have enough money to attract someone else to label data first. Speaking of the use of this my conclusions and the tools I use and test and develop, I intend the instruments I use in my study to be general. So I'm not saying that, no, this is just about nations at war or just about Russia and Ukraine. Obviously, the models are very context specific, but if you can use this approach to study other cases of dehumanization. So I intend to develop a tool that would be able to target dehumanization in different contexts, including political contexts, including related to migrants, including related to LGBTQ community, etc. So the only thing I would just add, okay, I'm speaking of blatant forms of dehumanization, because dehumanizing others is also an everyday phenomenon. Like statistically, we can say that we always perceived ourselves a little bit more human than anyone else. We perceived our groups to be more human than other groups. This is kind of natural. Doctors dehumanize their patients, and this is a protective mechanism. So not all dehumanization is absolutely terrible. And yeah, the tool I'm focusing, the phenomenon I'm focusing on is specifically blatant form of this. But I hope that, yeah. So after I finish my PhD, I will probably continue to generalize that to other contexts.
And then the other Sarah asks, thank you for sharing your research. Did you have any ethical issues in using Telegram data, since you do need to sign up with your telephone number?
Yeah, so I got ethical approval. Speaking of how I managed to do that, basically, I only using open data. Telegram is a very platform with many sorry, what's the word for that? Many different functionality. It has chats, it had group chats, some are encrypted, some are not encrypted. Chats may be open or closed to general, to others. And channels are also sometimes open, so that if you know the name, you can just find it and start following, or closed. And I'm not analyzing closed ones. Sometimes, yeah, as I mentioned in the beginning, sometimes they switch. So I first added Telegram channels to my data set, and then found out, oh, a week, 3 days ago or something, they moved to private. Okay, and I'm not using it for my data. I would say the type of data I'm using is public data. It is already in public domain. And these are most popular channels. Many of them have millions of followers. So speaking of that, if you mean some specific kind of ethical issues, please comment on that.
I have another question, ethics related, if I may ask.
Yeah, go ahead.
Was there any consideration within the ethics review process for these these studies related to your health, particularly your mental health, and the mental health of anyone else? That's in particular the qualitative analysis, where you have to sort of go into depth into these posts. Was that something that was considered?
Yeah. So, to be honest, so yeah, I discussed that in my ethical approval whatever the CURIC, we call it CURIC application. So I just promised to be mindful, etc. But to be completely honest, doing this research actually helps me, because I'm part of what's happening in any way. I'm from Belarus. My country is occupied by Russian troops because they invade. In the beginning, they invaded Ukraine from our territory, and we are still occupied. My family lives there. Part of my family lives in Ukraine. I have many friends in Russia. I used to live. I graduated from university there. So I used to study a completely different topic before the invasion, and it just lost its importance, meaning to me. By studying this topic, I gained some agency over what's happening. Mm-hmm. So yeah, sometimes locally in short term, it may cause me some distress, but to be honest, I read this anyway. I know what's happening, but yeah, short term, sometimes yes, and I know what to do with that. But in long term, it actually helps.
Basically, it's for you a tool to process the whole situation.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Any more questions from the audience online?
Oh, I see.
Yeah. But yeah, of
And it's
course.
potentially kind of related to your response where someone asked about you using the qualitative data to train like a custom model. I just was wondering your rationale between doing the 2 months prior and 2 months following, like that timescale, and then kind of related is your kind of deciding on the size of your like testing sample that you would
Mhm.
like your coding sample. So I was just wondering how you think.
Yeah.
decide on-
So I really needed a lot of dehumanizing posts. So in the beginning, my husband is laughing at me because he says, "Oh, in the beginning she was like, dehumanization is so terrible. I will do something about it." A year later, she's like, "This is an amazing Telegram channel. It has so many dehumanizing words there." So I just needed a lot of data for this study, and in the beginning it was very loaded, very intense. So that's basically the motivation for the choice of time frame. But also it was interesting to see what happened before and after. So that's why.
All right. Yeah, I would say let's wrap up slowly.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so
yeah,
much for
thanks
coming.
again, Lisa, and for me.
Thank you.
Thanks again, everyone, for joining online. And yeah, see you next time.